Our first moderator is Mr. Sinchang Chiu. Mr. Chiu is the Asia Program Officer at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Chiu to moderate the first panel.
Thank you, Ali. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate this first panel, this discussion on the new report that's been issued by the Uyghur Human Rights Project on religious freedom in East Turkestan. As Ali mentioned, my name is Sinchang Chiu. I'm a program officer on the Asia team at the National Endowment for Democracy. NED has supported UHRP for a number of years now and recognizes the Uyghur Human Rights Project's key contribution in documenting the conditions faced by Uyghurs. And these conditions, we believe, need to be elevated in a discussion about China's human rights. Sacred Right Defiled is the newest in a series of reports that UHRP has issued in the past few years. High-quality reports that should be read by policymakers in the DC community and anyone concerned about China's record on human rights. This morning we have the opportunity to go a little more in detail about the findings of the report with the two principal authors, Henryk Szadziewski and Greg Fay. Please let me introduce them to everyone here. Henry is the senior researcher at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. He has a BA in Modern Chinese and Mongolian Studies from the University of Leeds. Henry also has a Master's of Science in Development Management from the University of Wales, where he was awarded distinction for his work on Uyghur economic, social, and cultural rights. He lived in China for 5 years, spending 3 years in Kashgar, and he has been with UHRP since 2008. Greg Fay, at the end of the table, is a project manager at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and he has been with the organization since September 2012. Greg is a graduate of Brown University with a degree in East Asian Studies, and he wrote his honors thesis on bilingual education in East Turkestan. Greg also spent a year in Urumqi as a Fulbright scholar. So to begin our discussion, I have to say I learned quite a few things from reading the report, which was just issued last month. Some of these items include the specific conditions of travel that are placed on Uyghurs who are interested in going on the Hajj. And also regional regulation of religion in East Turkestan that is much more burdensome than what you see written into Chinese national laws, which is already very restrictive. And overall, it's quite disturbing that the government entities in China that are set up to oversee religion and religious affairs are the ones who are directly in charge of administering some of these restrictive laws and regulations on religious practice. We'll get into some more details about those findings in the report, but I did want to ask both Henry and Greg, perhaps we'll start with you, Henry, about the timing of this report. Why did UHRP feel that it was important for this report to be written now?
Well, thanks for those kind words, Chang, and thanks for getting my surname pronounced correctly. I do appreciate that. I think as Alan said, it has been 8 years since there was a systematic documentation of religious repression amongst Uyghurs, and that was a report issued by Human Rights Watch. It's an excellent report, and we felt that it was time for that documentation to be updated. We've been reading a lot in Radio Free Asia and also in reports of the State Department and USEF about a growing body of regulation that's stemming from 2005 when China issued national regulations governing religion. We also, in 2010, UHRP took a research trip to Europe and interviewed about 50 refugees in Europe, and a lot of the stories that we were hearing were that people were fleeing because of the restrictions placed on their religious beliefs and practices. So we felt that this was a very good time to look at documenting those regulations and seeing some of the implications of those, the implementation of those regulations.
Okay, great. I also wanted to ask a little bit about the methodology in creating this report and the research that you put into documenting everything that you have put into the report. It's always very hard to do good human rights reporting about the conditions in East Turkestan, particularly because access is restricted. There is some restrictions on travel there. It can be difficult for people like yourself to get a visa. So can you talk a little bit about how you put together the information that forms the basis of the report?
Sure. Ideally, as you say, we would like to go into East Turkestan and document these abuses. However, that is not possible. So in order to do primary research, we go and interview refugees. I took a trip and interviewed as many Uyghurs as were possible, and that was in Turkey. There's a growing number of Uyghurs coming to Turkey from East Turkestan. There are growing links, transportation links between the two countries. So it was a good opportunity to undertake that research. However, having said that, it was still difficult to find people who were willing to talk to me. It took me some digging to do that. However, those people who did come forward, I really had to stress to them the fact that we take the confidentiality seriously of their accounts, and so identifying details have been changed in the report. There are some serious consequences for Uyghurs talking to human researchers such as myself. The other element of the research methodology focused on secondary sources, which were in English, in Uyghur, and also in Mandarin Chinese. And what was particularly fruitful was going through Chinese government sources, but really picking and scratching below the surface, going beyond the regional and national level, just to township and county websites. And it's quite open, the repression. It's documented right there. Restrictions on dress, restrictions on all kinds of attending the mosque, for example. So in some ways, we were quite happy that the Chinese government were so open with their regulation.
That being said, it was difficult to figure out exactly what was the law in China. And this is something that we conclude in the report, that Uyghurs themselves have difficulty figuring out what is the law in China, figuring out which religious practices are even legal. And a good example of this, when we started writing the report, when we started researching it, China actually passed a new religious affairs regulation in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So, this is huge. This is the overarching legislation that governs all religious activities in the region. So after reading that this new legislation was being researched, we went to Human Rights Watch and asked for some advice on how to get our hands on the legislation, because the last iteration, an amendment was passed in 2001, which we read about in devastating blows, but even that 2001 amendment was not on the books. It's nowhere to be found on the Chinese web. So we found that it's possible that this major legislation was only publicized within the Religious Affairs Bureau. It was never publicized more widely. Later in the year, the new amendments were actually passed, and yet still the text was nowhere to be found. Nowhere on the Chinese web could we even find, the most basic legislation governing religious affairs. So that lack of transparency really shows how difficult it is, not only for international observers, but for people on the ground who know what the law actually says.
Greg, can you tell us a little bit about the type of Islam that's practiced by Uyghurs? It's probably pretty important for people to put the report into context to know about the type of religion that we're discussing.
Sure. So Uyghur people practice a modern form of Sunni Islam, but there are many other elements rooted in local tradition, as well as pre-Islamic, Buddhist, shamanist, and even further back in Uyghur religious history, Manichaeism and historian Christianity. So that's a lot of religions, but a practice that I think kind of illustrates how they all tie together in Uyghur religious practice is shrine worship. Uyghur people visit shrines which are to Sufi saints. So these are Muslim shrines. However, they reflect pre-Muslim beliefs. Some shrines Uyghurs visit for curing or for fertility. This is a Muslim practice in Xinjiang that you won't find elsewhere. So in these shrines also, they reflect the history in East Turkestan. There are shrines to Uyghur Islamic scholars like Mahmud Kashgari, or to historical Uyghur figures like the Ahmad Hoxha. So Mazar shrines, they illustrate the diversity of Uyghur religion. And they also illustrate how Chinese repression can affect Uyghur religious practice. Uyghurs visit these shrines en masse and make pilgrimages to the shrines. In 1997, the largest shrine festival was banned by the government. This was the Ordon Mazar Festival. Uyghurs came from across East Turkestan, thousands of people came, so that festival, was a major social activity. It was a time to exchange ideas, it was a time to share religion. So it was a religious moment, but it was also a social moment. After that festival was banned in 1997, not only did that social moment change, but also the economy of surrounding the Ordon Mazar, which dealt with thousands of tourists every year, it was greatly affected by no longer having this pilgrimage. So Uyghurs' practice of Islam, it does reflect the Uyghur history and religious history.
Thanks, Craig. Something I was curious about in reading the report is the individual Uyghur experience in trying to adhere to all the laws in China governing religion, but also maintaining the proper respect for one's own religion. Henry, perhaps you can talk about this a little bit. How can a Uyghur Muslim go through life being a proper observant Muslim, but also staying outside of the grasp of China's religious laws?
I think the very short answer is they can't. And it's a daily denial of their ability to practice their religious faith. And I think that what we found is there's a bewildering number of regulations that Uyghurs face every day. And there's confusion, and people are not too sure what's legal and what isn't. And the fact is that even customary practices are being questioned by Uyghurs. Again, the implication of that is that people being where they are in this repressive society in East Turkestan, they err on the side of caution. So rather than continuing with customary practices, they'd rather not do that. Some of the implications of running afoul of the law are serious. And some of the case studies that were documented, people have been in prison for up to 15 years for some of these actions. What we dig in a little bit deeper in terms of the regulations governing mosques, we found that if you were under 18 years old, you could not attend them, and if you were a government employee, you could not attend the mosque, and these are clearly signed outside of the mosques. The restrictions also governing Ramadan are particularly egregious. What was interesting about Ramadan is that it was just the detail that the government went into. For example, monitoring student dormitories' windows to see if the lights were coming on before daybreak, to see if that they were getting up and eating before the fast. And if that was the case, then they would face some punitive measures from the college. In government canteens, Uyghur government employees were provided free lunches and observed whether they would eat or not, and that would again determine whether they were fasting. Restaurant owners were forced to sign pledges that they would keep their restaurants open during Ramadan and the fast. And if they didn't, there were fines up to 800 RMB for that. The 2012, as far as we could tell, was some of the harshest regulations on record, some of the government work units were assigning people to stand outside mosques and check if government employees were entering, and then entering those names down. And again, punitive measures were in place, fines or demotions for that kind of action. The Hajj was, undertaking the Hajj again shows how it's very difficult for Uyghurs to complete their journey as a Muslim in their lives. Going on the Hajj is extraordinarily difficult. The restrictions openly say you need to be 50 to 70 years old. However, we've also found that that was not always adhered to. In addition, you have to join a group tour, and you're carefully vetted by the government if you have any previous anti-government views before you can go on that, before you can go on the Hajj. Passports were also routinely confiscated before the Hajj, so that people could not unlawfully, in China's terms, go to Mecca. The other thing that we found is that the group tours, well, the price was 30,000 renminbi, and just a quick look at the per capita GDP in, say, a Uyghur predominant area, Kashgar, it's 8,000 renminbi a year. In Hotan, it's 5,000. So you're looking at a lot of money for people ordinary people who want to go on the pilgrimage.
Thank you for that information. Can you talk a little bit about the religious leaders in Uyghur Muslim communities, the imams? What kind of restrictions are placed on them in the speeches that they're allowed to give at the mosques, and the freedom that they have to interact with their followers?
Sure, I'll cite an interview that I did with a former imam when I was out in Turkey. This individual it was a fascinating conversation that I had with him. He trained in an institute from 1999 to 2001, and what he told me is that half of his day was spent in political studies. So the lessons were about how Islam was compatible with socialism, or how to make the form of Islam that they were about to practice compatible with party guidelines. The other interesting aspect of his training, of course, he had to be vetted for anti-government views before he could embark on his studies. But also, he told me that in his 3 years, he only undertook 1 year of Quranic studies. He did, and was never told the meaning of what he was learning, and he never learned any of the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. So he felt that he hadn't been given any of the tools that he felt like he wanted to serve his community. He also told me that if you didn't cooperate with these restrictions, then you would be dismissed from the institute. He eventually served as an imam in a local village mosque from 2003 to 2008. And what he told me is that he had to go to the local village authorities, and they would tell him what to say in his sermons. You have to explain national laws governing religion, regional restrictions or regional regulations. Also, laws governing religion were the body of his sermons in the mosque. And he was asked various questions by the people who were attending, and sometimes he didn't quite know how to answer without upsetting the authorities. There was also a person present every Friday during his sermons. So he felt that he was essentially a government mouthpiece. And in 2008, he decided to stop, and then he said, I'm just going to go back and become a farmer. And was then pressured by the authorities to return to his role, and then fled from China and left his family back in China.
We only have a few more minutes, so I wanted to see whether either you or Greg wanted to highlight one or two of the recommendations that you included in the final pages of the report in our public session, and then we'll leave the rest of our time to Q&A.
I have two very simple recommendations really for the Chinese government. One is to ratify the ICCPR, and Articles 18 and 27 govern religious freedom. China does have a domestic body of laws that govern religious freedom. It should abide by them. For me, it's a simple matter. However, in addition, I would like to also recommend the inclusion of Uyghurs in the Islamic Association of China and also in the state administration governing religious affairs too. Uyghurs are genuine and meaningful representation and participation from Uyghurs in those institutions that would actually provide a real good balance in policies.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Greg. This concludes the panel. I hope everyone has learned a lot about what is inside the report that UHRP has issued and the implications for individual Uyghurs who either want to be imams in their community or who want to be devout Muslims. And the question of what is lawful, quote unquote, religious activity is something that is very problematic for Uyghurs, and it's definitely a black mark when we're talking about Chinese human rights. We want to take a couple of questions from the audience if anyone has questions. I just ask that you introduce yourself and any organizational affiliation you might have before asking your question.
My name is Yang Jian, with the Initiative for China, also known as Citizen Hall for China. I have a very specific question for you too. And when you do your detailed study, did you look into the floating population, Uyghur floating population in the mainland China? Those who in China work in factories and all as vendors, do they get together on a regular basis to practice their religious faith? Or if so, how the Chinese authorities respond to it?
Let me repeat the question just in case people couldn't hear back in the back of the room. Mr. Yang Ying's question concerns the floating population of Uyghurs in China and whether or not the authors looked at the population, whether or not their religious freedom is also impacted by the Chinese authorities.
Especially with our research on regulations, the regulations are targeting any kind of group, any mosque, so these floating populations who wouldn't have it would be, subject to probably similar regulations, but studying how religion or doing our research on how religion is actually practiced in East Turkestan, what we found was that anyone practicing their religion must be part of a state body, and the regulations of these state bodies are just growing more and more increasingly strict. So maybe we were people who are selling, who are in interior China, either in factories or street vendors, would be forced to practice sort of more on an individual basis. So our research wasn't focused on whether they were organized in mosques. In my own personal travels throughout China, I was always very interested in meeting these people. Sometimes you would notice them praying, but certainly I've never seen a Uyghur mosque outside of East Turkestan.
I have a question in the back.
If you could comment on why the Chinese government is not applying the state government deliberate systematic restriction on Muslims. Do you see any political purpose other than making the Uyghur Islam more sensitive as a state?
Nuri's question deals with whether China, or why China is not applying the same religious regulations to other Muslims in China, and whether the Uyghur Muslims are getting specific treatment that is different.
I'll speak to the institutions. From my own personal experience, both my parents are from Poland, and I visited very frequently to communist Poland in the 70s, and the Catholic churches were packed on a Sunday. It would be outdoor seating, And it was one way that people could show resistance to the communist regime in Poland. And I think that by undermining the very institutions of Islam, mosques controlling imams, even this, as I was saying earlier, the smallest detail of people's religious practices and beliefs, undermines any kind of Uyghur independent organization or some sort of coalescence that isn't within the control of the state. So, I mean, from that perspective, I think that that's very much an undermining aspect for Uyghur society or civil society in general.
I'd say, so in East Turkestan, the restrictions governing children's practice of religion are harsher than anywhere in China. These laws that have been passed forbidding not only children from practicing religion, but any individual or organization who lures a child into practicing religion. And I use those scare quotes because what does that even mean? You know, it's totally vague and up to government interpretation. It can be used really to try anyone. And what does that accomplish? It prevents children from learning their religion. It prevents that cultural transmission from going on. From that perspective, I mean, it really does look like these regulations are aimed at diluting Uyghur culture.
Any other questions? I'll just ask one question of the two authors. You can talk briefly about the situation of Uyghur Christians. You mentioned in the report there's one well-documented case about one Uyghur Christian who has run afoul of the government.
So Alan John is a very high-profile Christian case, and he's been tortured.
Sure. I mean, I think Arlen Jan's case is particularly egregious. I think that he was a house church leader and was arrested and now is in prison for 15 years, I believe. There are a number of problems with his case. He hasn't received any kinds of legal assistance, and he's also claimed torture, and there have been visible signs when his family have been allowed to visit. The case of the Uyghur Christians is really, really hard to get at. We couldn't get any primary source information. We mostly gathered information from China Aid and some reports that were coming through from news agencies. So again, what we have is this one case, and one theory goes is that the persecution of Uyghur Christians can also be seen as a wider ethnic persecution. So in some people's minds, it's not just directed at Islam, that this persecution is directed at Uyghurs.
All right. Well, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Greg. If everyone will give us a hand, give them a hand for